There you go. Well, my reaction to this is more about the end of this reading, this section, but it seems, and it's kind of weird. The way that I broke the readings up, we just got into his analysis of the evolution of the I, and then we stopped. But what can you do? You got to break it somewhere. But some of the stuff that he cites at the end, like what evolution of complex organs and convergent evolution, there's been a lot of work on that since his time. And so, I was trying to look some stuff up online right before this and found a few things, but my guess is that contemporary evolutionary biologists would say that the sort of things that he thinks are problems for the mechanistic view have actually been explained without having to resort to any sort of life impetus or anything like that. Anyway, that was my sort of general feeling. But that's more about the last third or so of the reading for today. That's my initial thought.
Yeah, I kind of skimmed through some of the pages after this to try to find kind of where his line of reason, his argument ends there, and it's quite a bit later. So it was indeed hard to break this up into neat sections because he keeps going for a while and you can't make the reading, 45 pages or whatever. But yeah, I'm pretty ignorant on a lot of contemporary biology, or really biology in general. I just have a basic understanding of it. I mean, most of us are philosophy people, humanities kind of people, so it's difficult. I mean, I think most of us have a basic literacy of science at least, but still it's difficult to kind of compare, like, okay, he was writing at a time that was almost something like 40 years before DNA was discovered. There's been so many developments, but I have no idea exactly how they interact with this. But then it seems like there's some people that are saying that he was pretty prescient on a lot of things. And I don't want to go into the whole systems theory complexity thing necessarily again, because I don't understand that stuff, but the little bit I do kind of understand, I see somewhat of enough of a resemblance to see why people are saying that Bergson's ideas are still relevant, and they're especially relevant to some developments that are contemporarily occurring or have occurred just in the past, few decades and whatnot. So I think that's interesting, but it's also interesting to look and see exactly where those lines of reasoning that he came up with actually fall short in a way. So I think convergent evolution is an interesting one.
Yeah, I was looking online a little bit, like I said, and one article sorry, didn't realize he was just internet hung. Anyway, one article I was looking at was Bergson actually addresses this. One article I looked at said you can explain convergent evolution where you have the same or similar biological structures evolve with no immediate genetic ancestry, purely because of similar environmental pressures. And Bergson seems to say that seems unlikely to him, but that the stuff I was looking at, one of the common examples is wings, for birds, bats, and bugs. and very, very different structures, but they all evolved wings because of whatever evolutionary pressures happen to be in the environment where they evolved. Whereas, you know, like the example, of course, like I said, we haven't gotten very far into his analysis of the eye, but, you know, the eye of the mollusk versus the eye of the vertebrate being so similar, he seems to find it unlikely that that sort of convergent thing could happen merely because of environmental pressures. And I'm not sure why. I should say, I don't know if Madeline wants to put her on the pressure. She's probably the most science-oriented person. She's a chemist by education and profession. I don't know how much that fits into these biological issues, but just make a note of that.
When I was reading this whole section, there were two things that jumped out at me. One was what I thought was his emphasis on duration, the element of time in biological processes. And the second one, even though it may seem contradictory in the beginning, is, I don't know if any of you have ever read Herbert Simon's The Sciences of the Artificial. And I thought of it again, Nevitt, when you just spoke now about independent biological evolutionary paths, but leading to a same physical characteristic of different animals. Simon argued that if you want to understand the complexity of any entity, you don't need to look inside, so to speak. What you need to do is to look at that entity's environment, and that any rationally designed entity is going to be able to function in its environment, because then if it isn't, it's not going to work, right? And I always thought that was interesting. He gave the example of when you look at the path of an ant, and if you didn't know anything about the topography of where the ant was walking, the ant's path might seem incredibly complex. But once you take into regard elevation, then maybe the ant's path makes all the sense in the world, because the ant is trying to get across the physical space with the least amount of expenditure of energy. So it's not going to constantly go up and down what to an ant would be a hill, but rather it's going to go through the valleys. And so that could be a torturous path, but it would be rational from that organism's point of view.
I guess kind of dovetailing into that. Oh, can y'all hear me, by the way? Yes, no, maybe so.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I just wasn't really getting any kind of reaction. I'm kind of confused, and I recognize part of the problem here is that we're like stopping midway into a section. But what is Bergson like presenting as an alternative to these two hypotheses that he's trying to sort of debunk by this discussion of convergent evolution? Like what is the actual counterclaim that he's trying to present? Because I don't really have a sense of it.
It was my sense that he's taking finality and altering it, or taking some aspects of it. Like I think he sees the finality as something valuable, but he doesn't want to argue that there's like ever an end to it, or that like will lead to some sort of synthesis or completion. So it was my understanding that he wanted to take the kind of one of those sides and say that if we take some aspects of it, we can create something new from it.
The way I think about it, classical a final cause is there is a pre-existing form that something is aiming to achieve. That's like Aristotle's final cause. So there's like already a predetermined goal that the system is in a sense aiming for. And he seems to clearly reject that notion of finalism. But the sense I get is that he says the way I think about it is like it seems to be almost like a vector. Like you don't know, you can't say exactly where you're going, so there's no final, form that it's going to end up at. But there's sort of a directionality or a vector that's sort of pointing in some general direction. And that vector is both a function of what's happened in the past, but it also can't be reduced to what happened in the past. That vector involves the possibility of creating something new that could not be reductively calculated from the past. Whereas, at least the way he interprets mechanism is you can calculate exactly what's going to happen. If it was purely mechanical, you could calculate exactly what's going to happen based on what happened in the past, because it's a causally closed system. And if you know all the causes, if you had a computer big enough and if you had exhaustive data, you could in fact predict the next state and the next state and the next state. But he thinks that, I guess because of the way I'm thinking of it as a sort of vector, there is a sort of aim to it, but of where things are going. And so that's my interpretation of his notion of finality or teleology. But you can either calculate it nor is it predetermined. Sorry, Brad, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say that I had some of the same questions as Ed and Sean, and you as well, now that have articulated part of that. I mean, I think when I read his rejection of finality and mechanism, it seems pretty clear to me that he's not rejecting their actuality in a sense. Reason and traditional philosophical forms of judgment and proposition seem to necessarily contain this element of mechanism, in that they kind of choose a piece of experience to hold up as a model by which their explanations can be grounded, and teleology in the sense that him tying intellect to action in this sort of genetic way. Everything that we action sort of contains in itself, conscious action contains in itself a goal towards which it is directed. So I think the difficulty in articulating right now what he's offering in contrast to this is I don't think he's really spelled it out. We've gotten this, there's a conceptual bedrock in time, it seems, that, ultimately the reason that mechanism alone or radical finality alone would have to be rejected is because they sort of efface the actual existence of time. In that even if we're, talking in the terms of prediction, the only way that we can predict is by setting up a model in the past and holding it up as something that we can repeat through experimentation. So, I mean, I can see this sort of appeal to, saying okay, well, this isn't how we experience time. We have this immediate experience of time that is a past directed towards a future through some impetus. But I think the difficulty of figuring out how he's going to do this, and I think what is the central question for me going forward is he's using reason to make this argument. So I think he's going to have to show us, if he wants to say that ultimately, we for some what the German idealist did, for instance, is we're going to move through every step of rational conceptualization until we reach this sort of almost hermetic mystical point, where we move beyond through a recognition of the different contradictions contained in reason, we can move beyond them through a sort of philosophical movement. I feel Bergson is going to have to do the same thing or something similar, in the sense that we have this conceptual bedrock in time. We can see this sort of origin of intellect and reason in our actions, or through our actions, through a sort of historical reinterpretation of the way that these things have developed. But yeah, it's I think what he's going to have to explain is how we can recognize what I think he calls the fringe of consciousness, these sort of edges, even though our means of recognition is fundamentally rational. It's going to be hard, I think, or I'm just looking forward to seeing how he can sort of hold up a new model of thinking, as opposed to the traditional philosophical model based in reason and representation.
If I, I really appreciate that point, because the whole time that I was reading through the chapter, Bradley, I was like seeing every time he would bring up the fringe, I was like, where, like he's getting at something, you know, but he's not, he's like teasing you, you know? and I noticed that every time, at several different points throughout the chapter, at page 47 and 53, and at different points, he's bringing up this notion of life in this sort of, what I imagine, by the way, for the structure of the chapter is that he's critiquing mechanism, then he critiques finalism, and then he says, okay, let's go for this sort of new sort of vitalism in a way. Let's think about that for a second. You know, he's not saying like, oh, this is the stuff, but he starts talking about this vitalism when he starts describing life as on page 47 specifically. He starts talking about the antecedents, right? And he says, like, if our action be one, in the middle of the page, on page 47, he says, but if our action be one that involves the whole of our person and is truly ours, it could not have been foreseen, even though its antecedents explain it, when once it has been accomplished, which is kind of just like a wishful thinking to me. I don't know, he's like, well, if it's gonna be ours, then it better be free. But then he goes on, and though it be the realizing of an intention, it differs as a present and new reality from the intention, which can never aim at anything but recommencing or rearranging the past. Mechanism and finalism, and therefore here only external views of our conduct. They extract its intellectuality. And that's the point that I think is the most, when he says they extract their intellectuality. I think that he's making this, your point about the reason that he didn't have to use, here's what I'm getting at here. Several different times throughout the text, it feels like when he's brought up against this problem, like mechanism and finalism use rationale and reason, but they're not doing the job. So we have to start getting creative in a way. And he starts saying that the free act is incommensurable with the idea, you know, and the rationale behind this free act, whatever this sort of freedom, this margin of freedom that we have, the rationale to it is the incommensurability itself, which sounds kind of weird and nonsensical at first, but Hegel has a very, very similar idea. And that's, I think that at multiple points in this text, I think Bergson was reading Hegel. I mean, of course, right? But I think that he's very directly kind of pulling from Hegel when he says that the rationale of the fringe of consciousness, that sort of fringe, the rationale there is the incommensurability. It's the irrationality to it. That's Hegel's idea of reconciliation. And I actually wanted to bring this up to the group earlier because I remember at a previous talk, everybody was talking about Hegel. And there was this idea that Hegel subsumed all non-identity into identity, that it's just a moment of identity and all this, and everything's under the great totalitarian umbrella of identity under Hegel. And I think that that's a misconception. And I only think that because I've been doing a lot of reading of him lately, so I'm not like an expert, right? I've just been very recently. But I think that his idea of the universe, of the system, of the reality which we face is incomplete. Not that the idea is incomplete, but that the universe under him in his system is an incomplete universe. And as we approach it, we see the chaos in the system. And that it's not like reconciliation means that it stops being so chaotic. We figure it out. We see patterns in the chaos. We start to get the bigger picture or something. It's that the chaos itself is the system. That's the rationale. We can always depend on it to be chaotic. You know what I mean? We can always depend on life, on this life force that he's describing, this thing that apparently we share with mollusks and on birds and all these things. He's describing this life as completely incommensurable with the idea, with ideas and rationality. But he says that fringeness, that marginalia, that marginal being, that is the only rationale that we can take from it. And as we try to put together a cohesive story, he says on page 53, he says that the future expands the present. I'm not actually sure where, I just wrote that down as a note, but I know that he says it somewhere on page 53, that the future expands the present. And to me, that he's saying that that things become, in a way, logically, rationally necessary only after they've happened. It becomes totally rational and logical and necessary for things to happen, but you can only say that once it's already happened. And that's Hegel's concept of the owl of Minerva, flying only at night, and so on and so forth. You know what I mean? And even at the end of, or during a chapter of Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel, he says, this, as of right now, where I'm standing, this is the position of the absolute. So he's relativizing the absolute in a way. You know what I'm saying? And I think that Bergson is doing that a lot. I think that Bergson is creating this sort of, he's trying to totalize the system in this way. So I don't really know what to do with that, because we stopped right before he got into the nitty gritty, I think, with the eyeballs. But I think that's the trajectory he's going, and I really would appreciate if anybody could stop me, silence me, kill me, do something to, you know what I mean? Chase, please.
Yeah. So a lot of interesting stuff, kind of exactly what I wanted to talk about. Oh, my internet is really bad. Okay, hopefully this doesn't, okay. So I think also I have the same concerns, that Sean has about, exactly what is he arguing about, what is wrong with both the mechanistic and the teleological finalist account of convergent evolution. And we don't really get his exact answer, but I think we can get a sense of what he's going to say and how he critiques mechanism and finalism, which is what you guys have just been talking about. And I think, so this reminded me of, and I think it has a lot to do with this notion about, time and trying to discern, exactly how things come into creation. Do they do it through this just repetition of these past elements, just mechanically cycling themselves in these different combinations? And then, so the mechanistic idea, I think the way that he talks about freedom and the creation of novelty is going to be a big part of what he's going to say about it. Exactly how he's going to do that, I'm not sure. But so one image that came to me was, I got this from Alan Watts, the English kind of Zen guy, but he talks about this, there's a boat in a lake, and this person, rows this boat out there, and you see a wake in its trail. And so the wake is a kind of past present, a sort of imprint or memory of that past action, but it didn't determine that action exactly. It determines basically the position of the boat where it is now, but only through this kind of spontaneous action in the present did it actually get there. So I think he's saying something like mechanism is a kind of saying that the wake of the ship determined the ship, where really he's saying, no, actually it's the spontaneousness of action in the present, this ongoing continuous creation. That's what we really need to focus on, rather than the wake of the ship, which, then you could retroactively say, point out like, oh, actually, look how this determined this through these imprints that we can look at. And that's always going to be a partial view, a partial reconstruction of it. And the same way, so finalism, teleology, I think he would say something like that the ship captain's intentions and goal of where he wanted to go, that's what actually determined where he goes. And he would say equally, that's just a partial, reconstruction idea of the whole totality, which is really basically probably the captain had some kind of intention in mind of where he wanted to go, but also there's a past that's really influencing the present, in that whatever position he is in the lake at that time, he's there to a certain degree because of where he decided to go in the past. So the past does influence the present, but not completely, nor does the future completely influence the present. So I think this idea of time is is really essential to understanding his critique of mechanism, of finalism. And I think that's ultimately what he's going to say about convergent evolution, in the sense that he's going to say that this is some kind of spontaneous creation of things that isn't totally determined by these past mechanisms, just coming into play, or some kind of ultimate goal of, the eyeball or whatever. Yeah.
Is it? I was thinking of a few things when the three of you, I'm losing track, four of you, were talking. You know how you said that that your sense of it was that something can be explained after it's completely happened. Begging your pardon for giving a political example from the United States. Overwhelmingly, most people looking at the 2016 presidential election did not predict Donald Trump winning that election. Yet, there's an amazing amount of new scholarship once it happened that actually provides very thoughtful explanations on why he got elected. And it didn't take 20 years for these explanations to emerge and to have a lot of more than surface plausibility for a lot of us who study U.S. elections. So to me, that seems to be true in kind of political processes. We may not be able to predict it, but fairly quickly we're able to understand, put the pieces together and say, oh, these all seem to work together. And then the second point I wanted to make is, remember, organisms don't exist in isolation, and I know that's a truism, but I think we have to be very careful to keep that always in the forefront of our mind. Part of the environment that any organism is in is other organisms. And like your sea captain example, right? He's not the only one piloting a ship in a lake. There's other craft. There's other people using that lake for a whole host of reasons. So it's not just the inorganic, or whatever you call water, environmental part, but also other creatures, other biological organisms.
One question I have is, why is adaptation not sufficient? And I think at this point, because we again kind of stopped him right at the beginning of his argument, he's probably going to try to answer that. But in terms of like what Chase was talking about, this notion of novelty, it's not obvious to me that natural selection and various modes of, some of the stuff I was reading just a little while ago talked about there's adaptation and exaptation, and there's various mechanisms that contemporary evolutionary biologists claim can explain the origin and evolution of apparently novel species and novel organic features. So I'm just curious, again, maybe it's just something we'll have to wait and see what he does, but it's not clear to me why the notion of adaptation and these other mechanisms really that contemporary biologists draw on, why they aren't sufficient to explain what he thinks of as true novelty.
Yeah, I can't answer either your question, Nevitt, or Chase's as to like why he thinks mechanism is not sufficient in biological terms. But I think philosophically, I agree that he's drawing on the tradition of like Kant and Hegel, in the sense that he's using this language. So I have a different copy, so forgive me if I can't like direct everyone to this sentence, but it's after a break in the fight right after radical finalism, where he writes, the error of radical finalism, as also that of radical mechanism, is to extend too far the application of certain concepts that are natural to our intellect. The reason that, at least like philosophically, something like adaptation that would see evolutionary changes as responses, like causally influenced by an environment would be, it couldn't ever be radically or adequately justified. Because in order, we would have to like have this view of the entirety of the system, of the like the whole itself, so that we could see the first cause, which would have to be unconditioned, because if there was something that was before that, then that would have to be included in the whole. There would have to be this we would have to be able to determine precisely what the like beginning was in order to like situate everything in like finally, without any skepticism ever being possible again, situate all of this within like a sort of chain, like a causal chain. And so when, you know, Bergson is recognizing that like rationally, we never have this, we're only having like partial views, like we can never see the entirety as such. You know, while you could always give an argument that like, oh, well, you know, based on induction and the way that we see things moving, like it would just make sense if this all was based on this like particular principle of like induction of, you know, causal relations between physical entities or like biological entities. But I could also always say that, like, you know, until you can show that that, you know, concretely in a like a picture of the entirety of the movement of evolution, you know, there's always, I can always just say like, well, you know, you don't know, like you can't ever prove it rationally, because you need this like sort of you need to be able to deduce it. You need like a concrete ground to move from. And I think, you know, so I take his point that radical mechanism is insufficient in the philosophical sense of never being able to be adequately grounded conceptually. But he seems to want to go a step further. So like with Kant, you know, you have like the realm of ends and the realm of, you know, material determinism. And we can sort of, you know, we have a choice just due to the sort of split structure of reason. We can choose between those ends without ever deciding once and for all on which is true, free will or determinism. But Bergson seems to want to take a second step and say like, no, like, even though rationally we could never decide as to, you know, whether radical mechanism in terms of like the way things are structured in this sort of like spatial sense, or radical finality as things moving towards ends, even though we can never decide here, we do have this access, this intuitive access based on our existence in time, our experience of duration, that sort of provides a way out of this impasse. Like we have this immediate feeling that there is something total, like something whole that we are participating in as individuals, that is not rationally accessible, but we feel at the edges of our sort of like rational experience of life. And so, I mean, yeah, so this gets back into the difficulty of like, okay, like even if I accept that it's true, how am I ever going to articulate it? Like, how will I ever put it in the language of like, that can be understood? Because, you know, in order to communicate this thing, I need to like be able to point to something that everyone can have access to. But like, it seems strange to say that like, oh, we all have a universal individual access to duration. I think this is kind of like what he's going to have to build up as his method.
You know, I have some kind of going back to what Hunter was talking about also. You know, like this whole question about the relationship of his ideas to Kant and to Hegel in particular. I think this is kind of interesting in a sense that, you know, I interpreted some of what he was saying as being a critique of possibly Hegel, but then so this has actually happened multiple times while reading this, is I'll even write Hegel in the margins, and then a few sentences later I'll realize he's talking about Kant, and I'll write Kant down. And it seems like Kant is the person he's almost constantly kind of beating on, where, you know, Merleau-Ponty, he was all about on Descartes, I felt like, where I feel like Bergson is all about, he's trying to separate himself from Kant, I think, in a lot of ways, but specifically in the point of this idea of like a final telos, you know, where, so there's different, you know, interpretations of Hegel in the sense of, you know, the dialectic has some kind of this dynamic that seems to be leading somewhere, but is this, you know, just one final static endpoint that everything is going towards? That would seem to align it with this idea of, you know, this radical finalism that he's critiquing, that everything is, you know, given there before. But then to counter that, you could say that, you know, a lot of what Hegel is saying is that, you know, in any kind of given, there's always some kind of remainder, always some kind of margin or fringe that is never completely able to be conceptualized. And that's what kind of drives this dialectic dynamic of this oscillation of these concepts. But ultimately, it's supposed to lead towards some kind of, you know, ultimate concept of something that integrates everything. So that almost, now that I realize, kind of sounds like almost what he's saying about, you know, this kind of original impetus of the creative, of duration itself, that's constantly, you know, the whole that all the parts, you know, take part in. It almost sounds like that, but almost in like a different temporal order, where Hegel is kind of going towards this, yet it's also kind of propelled by, you know, this strange attractor of the future completeness of the system or whatnot, which is also freedom itself in, I think, like an absolute manner. But so I wonder exactly what is, specifically the part that I was actually thinking of about Hegel and Kant and whatnot is, at least on my page or my book, it's 48, and that is the section biology and philosophy. It's right before he starts talking about Plato too. So he says, basically, he's talking about the history of philosophy, and he says basically it's always this eternal conflict of systems. You can never have some kind of ultimate system. The impossibility of satisfactorily getting the real into the ready-made garments of our ready-made concepts. And he says basically that this idea that everything would, you know, fully form into the idea that of the concept, you know, is kind of idealism that also is a kind of a finalism. It seems to me like you could interpret that as a kind of critique of Hegel, in the sense that I think what he's talking about is that there is, you know, these kind of absolute ideas that we're all being driven towards in the dialectic unfolding of all these things that he talks about. So I think what he wants to do instead, you know, is always kind of like put it into the process of time unfolding itself in this continuous manner, rather than at some end goal totally or some past totally. But yeah, I'll see what, if anyone has anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, I mean, one of the difficult things here is that he seems to want to talk about an impetus that's non-teleological, which seems to be unconceptualizable. Like, it's difficult to think a movement that isn't moving towards something.
That's why I was using the, I guess, metaphor of a vector, which is still, I mean, it still has the problem. I mean, it is pointing, so you think it's got to be pointing to something, but, or maybe a trajectory, like there's some kind of trajectory. But I see the problem. Even the notion of a trajectory still seems to imply the notion of it's heading toward something. You know, with regard to, I'm sorry, Chase was going to respond to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that's why he doesn't totally negate finalism, that he says there is still some kind of goal occurring in these things. And if you think about like the way he talks about action or something like that, and the intellect, that the intellect formed as part of our action in the world, then it is based off some kind of intentional structure of interpreting these things and simplifying them for our actions. So he seems to, kind of to a certain degree, kind of equate life in general with this notion of being able to kind of filter out aspects of the world, and then in order for us to act on them in some way that helps us survive or whatnot. So it seems like there has, I agree that there definitely, without any kind of a notion of a goal, that is definitely, you can't really conceive that. And he even kind of critiques mechanism in that sense by saying that, mechanistic science that says, all this is totally pre-given mechanisms, unthinking, unintelligent things just playing themselves out, that in order for them to think about particular cases and to describe anything, they have to use the language essentially of a kind of intelligence, almost like a homunculus that exists in these apparently unintelligent things, where like, Richard Dawkins, he talks about like the selfish gene and things like that. And then if you get into kind of, the only way you can talk about these things is still through this very human language of it, about intentionality, that these things have wants, like the genes want to, reproduce themselves and things like that. And that's why it's so difficult to really talk about, I think, like total mechanism, because there has to be some kind of at least partial aspect of in thinking of terms of intentionality and goals and whatnot to think itself. And another example of that I think would be something like eliminative materialism that wants to get rid of folk psychology, which would be the normal way that we talk about things in terms of our psychology. Like if you think of any kind of a mind state of, I want to do this, then if you're not talking about basically, B receptor antagonist, dopamine receptor, chemical B, blah, 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 that kind of like neuroscience talk, then you're just making up some kind of illusory kind of thing. But then to even talk about that, you have to then use this notion of an illusion to what? That's also a kind of folk psychology, that where there's some kind of a mind or attribute to something beyond a kind of physical system. So I think, he wants to have some kind of notion of finality or goal or intentionality to some degree. And I think he almost equates life to a kind of variable development of that. But then at the same time, he's definitely critiquing that as some kind of like a pre-given thing, I think, at least. It's almost like the goals have to be partial and also created kind of spontaneously or something like that. So maybe that's kind of what he says about convergent evolution. That like basically these are things that change. They do this in a kind of spontaneous way like that, rather than as some kind of, absolute final goal or all about these mechanisms that just unintelligently play themselves out.
What about either the level of analysis or unit of analysis? When you, Chase, do something, am I going to interpret that as you're part of the human race and you're part of the evolutionary thrust for Friday, June 5th, or am I going to be looking at you as one biological organism that has some goals? And I think we have to be careful in two things. On what level are we talking, or is Bergson talking, when it comes to intentionality and evolution? And did the first fish that tried to crawl on the ground think, my goal is sometime in the future, Albert Einstein? Or was it just, no, I gotta, I think there's more food here or something. I can't imagine how a fish thinks. And also, I really think that if we could get a handle on his concept of duration, because I don't think he necessarily says duration equals time. I mean, I think if he thought duration equals time, he might use time. But I think he uses duration enough that I think he's trying to get at some kind of sense of process over time. But anyway, those are two things I was thinking of when you were speaking.
Yeah. So actually, looks like Hunter wants to talk, so I'll go.
I have to go. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say goodbye.
Okay. See you.
See you, bud.
Chase, I want us to return to duration in a second. But before we do, I feel like there's a marble rattling around in my brain that I have to knock loose before we keep moving. And that's that you said earlier, and this is because I'm an idiot and I feel a need to say things like this, but you said earlier that this might be a critique of Hegel in this notion of the garments, fitting things into our ready-made garments, because Hegel is creating this sort of progress towards the thing, the idea. I think that this idea of yours may come somewhat from your background in Deleuze, because I know Deleuze's critique of Hegel on repetition, which is that Hegel can't really conceive or didn't think of purely mechanical repetition. You know what I mean? Okay, so basically, here's my thing. I think, and this is just a defense of Hegel, I suppose, but I think that Hegel really did understand repetition in a real way. And I think that Kierkegaard and Freud were the ones who said that there was a non-productive, pure repetition of elements. You could have one and then one again and nothing else. It's just happens with nothing being produced, right? And this repetition of Hegel's is fantastical in some sense, or disconnected from reality, but only because I think it does something that I think is vital. I think that Hegel's repetition, right? Hegel's definition of repetition is, yeah, you're right. There's not really any pure mechanistic, I guess, repetition, but that's only because when you repeat something, it's his old example of Caesar. When you have the first Caesar, it's the person, it's the contingent reality that exists, right? The second Caesar, Octavio, is a title. It's the notion. It's the idealist version of Caesar. It's the concept of Caesar. It's the things surrounding Caesar in a social symbolic logic. You know what I'm saying? It's not just a contingent object. It is now the idea of Caesar. Or to put it into kind of technical terms, the necessity of the event. And let's call Caesar the event here. The necessity of the event, when it repeats itself, it goes from being in itself to for itself. Does that make sense? The first iteration of Caesar was in itself. It needed to happen because it was the way it is. After that, it was for itself. It was in the service of an idea. You know what I'm saying? And Deleuze has this whole point that Hegel's repetition, or Hegel's inability to think of pure repetition, keeps him from being able to think of something new. You know what I mean? Where like, Deleuze credits the repetition of Hegel as not bringing something new, but explicating what was already there in some sort of sense. There's nothing new. It's just what's already there. And Deleuze argues that the really new can emerge only through pure repetition. You know, in this sense, and to give everybody kind of a salient example, it's like if Jason and I were talking about the state, if we were critiquing the state, and then he and I were undermining it, saying, oh, the state sucks, or the state is for losers. That's not new. That's not a radically new way to critique the state. That's just a normal, day-to-day common fare. But what is radically new for Deleuze is using the same terms, talking about the state exactly as we would now, but to a point where the horizon of meaning, the entire horizon of meaning has changed so radically that we refer to an all-new notion of the state when we use and repeat the same ideas. We're talking about the state, but the horizon of meaning is so radically altered due to our repetition, our purely mechanistic repetition, that we refer to an all-new notion. And true change, therefore, is to say the same thing with radically new meaning. That's Deleuze's. But I would say, and this is my final point, this is the last of my ranting, Hegel knew this, and that's why he referred to things like the phrase, a rose is a rose, or boys will be boys, you know, or if I do something gross or obscene in front of pleasant company, people go, oh, Hunter's Hunter, you know what I mean? Hunter's gonna be Hunter. That phrase implies that the concept already bursts asunder its container. Do you know what I'm saying? The fact that you could say in pure repetition, Hunter is Hunter, implies that the notion Hunter is bigger than the other Hunter. There's more to Hunter than there is to Hunter. There is a permanent excess from the container, constantly, with all concepts. And that's my immediate point, and I'd love to hear if you have anything to think or whatever, but also, I'd really like to return to duration, because I think that Ed was really on something there, that like that might actually kind of unlock this puzzle box. Hegel won't, maybe, or arguing about Hegel won't, maybe, but maybe duration will.
Yeah, those very interesting insights. I actually have, I personally think, oh, my cat's moving. So I personally think Deleuze is a bit harsh on Hegel, and a lot of people have criticized his view of Hegel as being overly polemic, and part of that is because his teacher, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, it's like Hippolyte or something like that, but he's like this famous kind of like Hegelian, like continental philosophy guy, but he's basically kind of critiquing his interpretation of Hegel more than Hegel himself is usually the way that he's interpreted. Is I personally, I see, I can see Hegel as a kind of process philosopher in the sense that he's always working in this kind of organic model of something is never, you know, totally there and present. Like you said, there's always this kind of remainder to things. And I think that part is very interesting. And that also kind of goes along with what Deleuze is saying and what Bergson is saying in a lot of ways, that there always is this kind of, you know, the fringe outside of these things. And I think the problem they would have with Hegel would be that he puts it into a kind of idealistic framework where it's basically ideas operating to some kind of ultimate concept, but he still kind of conceptualizes the totality of it as something. But then, to his credit, I think that that concept, that, you know, the grand concept, capital C or whatever it is in German. What is it in German? It's like Begriffen, or I don't know. But I think that is something that isn't totally given in the system necessarily. And I think you could, that's a good way to interpret Hegel, is that there isn't something totally pre-given with any one state, that it's and that's why it's constantly in momentum and moving towards something. But then the question is basically, what is it moving towards? Is that already pre-given as some kind of totality? So that, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about Hegel to give a, you know, any kind of definitive interpretation of that. But I think to some degree there's definitely something similar about what Bergson, Deleuze, and Hegel are saying, in that there is always this kind of margin outside of what we're conceptualizing at any kind of present time. And that's also part of this flow of time, in the sense that, so like you're talking about basically, you know, tautologies of identity and whatnot, that, you know, Hunter is Hunter and whatnot, that, you know, the concept is always something outside of, you know, this given present. And in a way it's kind of moving towards that, or it's not. It's always something that is kind of like a ghost there. It's like like what Derrida would call like a hauntology, you know? And I think that's interesting, because you could say that that's because of duration, in a way, that, you know, there's being and non-being, but that dichotomy doesn't make sense in terms of time flowing, in that sometimes something at, you know, time point A can change and become something different at time point B. And because of that, identity is ruptured by time to the point where, you know, some kind of larger conception of something, of a temporal object, it both kind of shares something with any kind of instantaneous, you know, indexical like demonstration of it, like Hunter at time A when he did zany event, you know, is Hunter as temporal object. And so I think time is essential to kind of understanding that, and the way that he sort of, because he Hegel, he critiques a lot of you know, the basic fundamental concepts of logic as being that they only make sense in terms of these static objects. In the same way that Bergson talks about, you know, the intellect talks about solid objects in space. I think he's saying something similar in that, you know, in terms of becoming as opposed to just static being, then we have to think of new ways of talking about identity and process and unfolding and all these things. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to jump in and poke at like the idea that Hunter is talking about Hunter is Hunter, this kind of concept that's like bigger. I latching onto that phrase, I don't think I quite understood it when you said it, Hunter, but the necessity of the event, and these kind of like the second Caesar is, you know, in the idea or the concept of the first Caesar, and thinking that like might that maybe like reflect onto like what Bergson is talking about, and that like these aren't intentions we're moving towards, but there's like an impetus that we're moving out of. So we're like, is there a Hunter that's moving out of the concept of Hunter? Is there a Caesar that's moving like out of the concept of Caesar, the furthering Caesar? And can we see, is that maybe that what he's getting at in these kind of like, in that species endure, the universe endures, we endure, we evolve and ripen like out of a concept, or out of this kind of life impetus, if that's what we want to call it. That's what Bergson wants to call it. And then, yeah, I'm jumping to that section that you referred to again at the beginning of the seminar, like page 47, 48. I just keep coming back to that, where it's talking about like the realization of the intention is always different than the intention. And the free act, its rationality is in its incommensurability. Then I was also kind of pairing that as well to towards the end of this section, page 57, 58 in the text that it seems like most of us have been referencing, but quest of a criterion section. He's talking about like the idea of like active adaptation, in which it's like an external mold imposes itself. But he gives the example of saying that like that ready-made mold is never just the only factor in creating the next wave that's happening. But he talks about that it's also not an intelligent, or the adaptation that occurs from being like presented a mold from like an external circumstance is never like an intelligent activity that's taken up by an organism. And I feel like this is where he's kind of like trying to move away from that finality once again. He's thinking that's through too anthropomorphic, and he says that there's still a kind of like a passage out of this concept. I don't know, that section, just page 58, 57, quest of a criterion. I'm kind of trying to make sense of what he's getting at when he says that it's not an anthropomorphic element, and how that ties into how things are making these decisions or enduring.
I want to go back to that page 47 where Joey just was. I don't know what editions people have. It's like 5 paragraphs into the biology and philosophy, and this is part of this is trying to get a better sense of duration, but also he keeps using the word psychology, and he seems to be saying that the creative activity of I guess the cosmos as a whole bears certain similarities to the way that a mind works. Not that, I mean, I don't think he's saying that there's like a, you know, like a thinking being or anything, but that there's certain similarities in the way this process of the universe works and the process of mind works. And at the bottom, very bottom of 46, the last sentence, he says, as soon as we go out of the encasings in which radical mechanism and radical finalism confine our thought, reality appears as a ceaseless upspringing of something new, which has no sooner arisen to make the present than it has already fallen back into the past. And then at this exact moment, it falls under the glance of the intellect whose eyes are ever turned to the rear. But I think that description there, it's not, I don't know that that's a definition of duration, but I think it's a description of what duration is like, or maybe if not what duration is like, it's what I think he thinks of the ground of time is something like that. So I think he thinks, my sense is that what he thinks is happening, because not only in the mind, but in the universe, is that the universe, the cosmos, is this constant upwelling of the new. It's just constantly bubbling up or emerging, and that is the ultimate ground of what we think of as time. So, you know, we tend to think of time as this big, you know, at least the traditional way is this big empty space time box, right? So there's this big three-dimensional, like the holodeck, and stuff happens here, and time is this big, like a big three-dimensional box in which things happen. And, you know, Einstein says, no, it's space-time is all mixed together. But I think this is even more, even further away from that notion of time as being a static temporal frame in which events occur. That's the sort of mechanistic time that he thinks is not what time is like, but it's what the intellect likes to make time look like. So I don't think, I mean, my sense is he doesn't think, I think one reason he uses duration is because I don't think for him, metaphysically, there is any time. There's just this constant swelling forth of the real and the new, this bubbling up of the real, and that is the process that produces motion, movement, change, and so on, is this upswelling of the new. And then what the intellect does is the intellect looks back on all that has happened, and then it constructs this artificial notion of temporality or space and time, and then it can then divide it up into little, you know, sections and conceive it in this sort of abstract time box. But I think that for him, you know, duration is this experience of the creative swelling forth of the new, both in the cosmos as a whole and within the mind. That's my sense.
Yeah, I think, so his notion of time, I definitely agree with that idea of it, that in a sense that he's talking about this kind of, you know, upsurge of novelty. But then that sounds like, I think another crucial element, though, to his view of time is this role that the past has, or memory, in terms of a kind of, there's a kind of contraction, or, so there's basically the past is always kind of contained and enduring within the present in a way that's kind of simultaneous with the upsurging of the new, and that it's kind of how exactly the past is contracted into the memory of something, that the novelty comes into existence as in its pixeity, to use that term from Merleau-Ponty and all the other people, but, and that, you know, in its thisness of the novel, it has to in some way come as a kind of upsurging that is influenced by this force of the past, but that's not like this totalizing, mechanical like pushing, but instead it's a kind of selective contraction of the past into the upsurging of the present. So I think it's hard to talk about this stuff, obviously, but there's something kind of going on in terms of that. And I think that's crucial to understanding his idea of life and organization in these things, in the sense that he says that basically, there's I can't remember where it is in our reading, but he talks about, things that have minimal kind of durational qualities. Like you imagine just like a rock, it stays relatively stable throughout time, but then something that can basically bring back a lot of its memory of the past, like a mind, like a psychology, those things are more dynamic. That's like what a living system is a kind of, it's a greater intensification of that aspect of being able to contract the past selectively into the present and think in terms of a history and memories and whatnot. So even though, yes, the rock is a temporal object in the sense that it's still, it came into existence through all these forces, the earth and whatnot that produced it as this, and it'll eventually, go away and deteriorate and whatnot, but on a very different rhythm than these living objects, which are much more dynamic. So it's almost like, in terms of music, you would have, a rock would be something just like this constant tone where you're just like holding down a keyboard, like brrr, like that, just constantly. And then living organisms are something like a melody, like a doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, like that. So I think that's one way to think of, I think, this difference between, what he talks about, like inert matter versus living matter. And also this, basically these notions of how time is working exactly, and how, in some sense, this spontaneous action works with the past, but also with the future, that are kind of spontaneously and simultaneously linked in this dynamic, this reciprocal dynamic of some kind.
Yeah, I have a lot of I've been reading, actually, it's the section between the two passages that Joey mentioned. So it's like around 51 to 53. There's a lot that I'm seeing that I think supports kind of what you and Hunter have been saying about Hegel. And I think it does support what Hegel is saying, actually. Or what I think Hunter's interpretation of Hegel is, at least. So, at the top of 51, he says, I mean that the original impetus is a common impetus, and the higher we ascend the stream of life, the more do diverse tendencies appear complementary to each other, which I think is, kind of the whole dialectic stuff kind of coming into view. But then later he says, this is not due to an identity of it is due to an identity of impulsion and not to a common aspiration. So he's not saying that there's like an end goal, but that we have this feeling of identity that exists within us that kind of pushes us forward to be whoever, kind of like the hunter is hunter thing. That identity exists beyond in the excess of things, right? And so further, he kind of continues talking about that for a while. And then at the bottom of 52, he talks about kind of the two problems of finality, right? So in short, the theory of final causes does not go far enough when it confines itself to ascribing some intelligence to nature. So in describing nature as having feelings or having some identity of having impulses, he's arguing that we're not going far enough in describing that and looking into that. And he says that, and it goes too far when it supposes a pre-existence of the future and the present in the form of idea, which is kind of what you're saying, like assuming some end goal that we're going to create some idea that completes everything. And then the next part he says, in the second theory, which sins by excess, is the outcome of the first, which sins by defect. And I think what he's basically trying to say is that the problem, finality isn't necessarily the problem, but the way we view finality is with too much focus on the complete end idea rather than on the excess, which is perhaps what is building it, what is more important within it. So, and then at the very end, he says, our intellect has a right to consider the future abstractly from its habitual point of view, being itself an abstract view of the cause of its own being. So I think he's making an argument that we should look and really consider nature and this building evolution as an intellect, as something that is not as an intellect, but as something that has feelings, I think, more. I don't think he's talking necessarily about the rationality or the reason behind it, but of the feelings we have and how those feelings kind of control us and affect us in our lives, and how those feelings aren't necessarily connected to a mind. They're not something that we can necessarily grasp. They're hard to talk about, like, in our daily interactions with people, it's hard to talk about our feelings, So I think that in a way, something that I really appreciate about it is I think that there's a lot to the feelings that we have. And I think they have a lot to say about biology, about philosophy, about our experience, about stuff like that. And I think he's making an argument here that feelings are kind of at the basis of nature and a lot of things that we kind of separate ourselves from, and say that feelings are different and separated from rationality, and we kind of pull those apart. I think he's arguing that at the very least, we should analyze finality by imagining that nature could have feelings and that it could be this thing that wants its own identity and it could be impulsive. That's what I think.
Yeah, I remember towards the beginning, he talks about, I think it's the survival of the past into, consciousness and whatnot I think he critiques the idea, I think, of instincts, or I can't remember, but he talks about basically the notion that I think that the past, when it enters the present or whatnot, it does so through this kind of tendency and of feelings and I think, is it impulses? I think he says. So he's kind of, trying to critique this notion of, like a mechanical psychology or biology by saying that it's really kind of, you see these things as feelings and tendencies and these different impulses to do things rather than necessarily as these concrete ideas of intentionality or like, I'm going to do this. Okay, I'm doing it. He sees it much more as this kind of, kaleidoscopic kind of thing where I think that's part of this whole idea of like, this fringe and this variation in things is that there is a kind of ambiguity to these things. So I think also part of that is because, so something Hunter said, I think it was quite a while ago now, about, this kind of like irreducible complexity to it, and that, you look into any of these systems deep enough, you see that you can't give some kind of totalizing explanation of them. And that's where it kind of ties in with, complexity theory, which I think I said I wouldn't talk about at the very beginning, but I think at least now that Sean isn't saying anything, I feel confident enough saying something, in the sense that from my limited understanding, I think it's basically, okay, you look at a complex system and there seems to be, no kind of repeatability to it, in the sense that even when something seems to be the same, if you look hard enough, there's actually some kind of minute difference to these things, because the kind of, and from a classical perspective, from a kind of reductionist perspective, they would say that's because there's some kind of noise in the system that's deviating it in this kind of variable way. Because really it's this kind of thing where, given conditions A, B always occurs, and it's this kind of automatic thing. We're in a complex system. There's always some kind of variety to it, and you can't necessarily predict a starting state or any kind of, from a starting state, from these starting conditions, you can't predict what's going to happen necessarily in the future. Actually, I may be wrong about that, because I think there is some kind of ways that they can do that. But anyways, I think what's important here is this notion that, there is always some kind of complexity of these things, because the chaos, the complexity, the variability, the duration of it is embedded in the system. And that's also part of, psychologically what we feel. And that is this kind of, there's always these backgrounds of these feelings and these impulses and things, just a kind of qualitative multiplicity where we're constantly feeling all these things, but they're not things necessarily. And to try to all these ways that the past is influencing our mind at the time, and what we were reading in the news just earlier, and there's all these influences, these incredible influences that go into even just like your emotional state, and then somebody will be like, "How are you?" Good. Like, language cannot grasp that, and I think that's part of like this idea of like this remainder that he's constantly talking about. And I think part of that remainder does have to do with this notion of time. Not only as something that kind of flows, so it constantly kind of ruptures identity, but also in the sense that it creates this kind of multiplicity in any one present thing, because the past is constantly kind of virtually present in whatever the present is. That was a kind of mixed up word usage there, but hopefully you guys get what I'm saying.
Going back to 47 again, right after where I finished before, so he makes that statement about the upspringing, and then he says this is already the case. This is already the case with our inner life. For each of our acts, we shall easily find antecedents of which it may in some sort be said to be the mechanical resultant. And it may be equally well said that each action is the realization of an intention. In this sense, mechanism is everywhere and finality everywhere in the evolution of our conduct. But if our action is to be one that involves the whole of our person and is truly ours, it could not have been foreseen, even though its antecedents explain it once it's been accomplished. And though it be the realization of an intention, it differs as a present and new reality from the intention, which can never aim at anything but recommencing or rearranging the past. And so I think interesting there, he says he makes intention a function of the past. So it seems like what he's suggesting there is this intention is not part of the creative act. The intention is actually the part of the act that is a resultant of the past. But then, so that, like Chase is saying, the past is always present in some sense, but then there's this new that also emerges. And so again, if you take this sort of psychological description, and as he seems to take it as a description of reality as a whole, I don't know, that one reason I keep thinking of a vector is when he uses words like tendency. But I wonder if maybe a tendency in the world as a whole is something like intention in consciousness. And so, my intention, I cannot, at least the way he thinks of intention, my intention is always a resultant of past things, but then apparently my actual choice is not restricted to that intention. My actual choice is somehow a manifestation of this self, if there is a self, this sort of process and duration that's carrying the past and has an intention to the future, but then apparently my action, my choice, can it's somehow, I mean, a function is probably not the right word because that makes it sound deterministic and mechanistic, but it is this internal, ever renewing process in the midst of duration that mixes with this intention that's a function of the past to produce some kind of choice in the future that's not, can't be merely reduced to that past life. If that made any sense.
Kind of thinking that I'm going blank now, but intention as like, you know, or you're saying the decision comes about is different from our intention. I would think that he's more so saying that like the realization of an intention is always different. So, you know, maybe our decision might be in line with an intention, but like what comes out of it is always like a new form that was unforeseeable. And that like, it's not our mind it's not the intellect, it's not consciousness and its intentions that's participating in this thing. That's only like one thing we can carve out of it after the fact. But there's like the tendency, which we might say is part of nature. There's a tendency that goes beyond intention. And that's kind of like a more general force that's playing a role in the realization of events, of intentions. Like the intention is just a kind of like maybe a conscious small aspect of it.
So
The word tendency, probabilistic certainty. You know, think of modern physics as opposed to Newtonian, right? Heidegger's principle of uncertainty. I mean, I can understand why Bergson would be talking about tendencies rather than certain outcomes.
So because I think he wants to specifically, so I went back reading, and this was a while ago, but to give a little bit of credence to some things Nevitt said earlier. So in the previous section we read, he makes an explicit connection between, so this is on page 31, near the top, or whether they must not rather be compared, and the thing he's comparing is what he calls, well, I can use back the page actually. The only question is whether the natural systems which we call living beings must be assimilated to the artificial systems that science cuts out within inert matter, or whether they must not rather be compared to the natural system, which is the whole of the universe. So he seems to think that, like, if you go back to the first section that we read, consciousness, I found this and then I lost it. I think it's around page 24, 25. Consciousness is like biological organisms, right? Those two things are basically organized bodies or organized or natural systems in the way that he talks about it. And then those two things are like the whole of reality when you can conceive of it as a collective sort of thing. And it seems like what he wants to do is he wants to make a distinction between that and this kind of unorganized bodies or inert matter in the way that we're thinking about that. And what seems to be the important distinction in terms of this question of duration is duration as in a kind of like accumulation of forces makes it so that the things that organized bodies do, like biological entities or consciousnesses or the whole of reality, the whole, are not predictable in terms of a reductionist equation, right? And it seems as though like that has something to do with the way that they are the product of a kind of interaction of all of the contingencies of their history and of their nature. And then they're interweaving with their environment based on a lot of the quotes that you know we could look at from his current discussion of things. I don't know if that quite adds to the conversation, but at the very least, like I in terms of him discussing freedom and in terms of the thing that that Nevitt was just saying, like I think that this is he has like a very specific idea of the conjunction of a bunch of different factors leading to a novel piece of nature that wasn't predictable in terms of what we'd seen before, and not necessarily of like conscious free choice, because right, according to what he's saying, we have a psychological tendency to want to reduce everything down to mechanisms, these types of inner conceptions of nature. So like it might not be that the way that we describe or approach or you know, sort of try to go about decision making and action and planning resembles at all this tendency on the part of living beings, of our consciousness, and of the whole of the reality to produce actual novel things.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that ties in with pretty well with what Joe was saying about, you know, intentionality, and that I don't think what he's saying is that, you know, it's like as humans, our very conscious choice to do this or that is where this freedom and this novelty is coming from. I think he would say that that's maybe kind of like a special partial aspect of that, maybe. But I think really what he wants to say is that, you know, novelty occurs because of the whole interaction. And I think his problem is basically with saying that there's these pre-existing given elements, these sections of things that are these idealized elements or units, and that they reoccur but in just reassembled ways, and that's how things kind of work. And that's a way to kind of deny that there's any kind of real novelty. And so I think what he's trying to say is that, you know, in order for there to be novelty, it's this creation of, or sort of like interaction with the whole, kind of fluctuating within itself. And by saying, you know, that it's just like I'm just deciding to do, you know, this action here, that's itself a kind of sectioning off into an element of, you know, conscious choice, which is obviously very anthropocentric, and I think he's trying to do something very different. And I think that goes also with the idea of a kind of intentionality, of a kind of, you know, conscious, you know, intention to do something, where I think it's more kind of like what Travis is talking about, in the sense of, you know, it's the whole of our psychology in a way that where it kind of brings novelty and transformation to existence for us. That's we make decisions with the whole of our body and our mind, and even then that whole is within this whole system, and the threads keep going and going until you can see that we act and create novelty really within the scope of the whole, almost as an expression of the whole. And so I think that's important to note, in the sense of what he's kind of talking about in terms of novelty. So going back, one question I have for Nevitt. So you're mentioning vectors, and I think I kind of get what you're saying, in a sense of, you know, a vector is, you know, a kind of point of departure or whatnot from a given point or something like that. But I'm kind of my mind just kind of can't totally, I think, grasp exactly what you mean by vectors. So I'm kind of curious about that, because it seems important for some reason. Yeah.
Probably because it's just a vague metaphor in my mind. But maybe it's because of the stuff he was talking about earlier with differential equations. But you know, if you think, I don't know if you guys remember anything from calculus, but you know, if you think about a curve, you can talk about the slope of the curve at a particular point. me to take too long to, what page? Yeah, there you go. Composed of straight lines. What page is that on? We can't hear you.
Sorry, 31.
31.
Yeah, that's where he's talking about the tangents.
Yeah, and so, you know, the tangent lines, exactly. And so I was kind of thinking of maybe more of that than vectors per se, but like if you, that's what I was talking about, trajectories. So if you imagine, you know, a curve, any curve, well, that's a function, you can calculate the tangent at that point, and you could, you know, you could create a little vector from that, and that sort of gives you the trajectory of that curve at that point. But that doesn't mean that the curve isn't necessarily going to move some other direction. And so that's just sort of the general idea I have of, you know, when he talks about tendencies, is like this thing is kind of moving in this direction, and so it kind of has this tendency. But that it doesn't necessarily mean that the curve is going to, curve isn't necessarily a straight line, is just going to follow that tangent on out, but that just happens to be the slope at that point, and the curve might in fact do something else. And so again, it's a kind of vague thing in my mind, but that's why when I hear him talking about tendencies but trying to avoid any sort of finalism, it's almost like finalism would be everything is a straight line, you know, and if you know the direction, you can just look and see, you can write the equation of that line, and you can figure out where it's going to head from here to eternity. But if there's some indeterminacy in what that curve is going to do, if there's other stuff that's beating on this curve, that's, or whatever that process that curve represents, you might be able to figure out where it's headed right now. And you might be able to go back and calculate where it was headed at all times in the past. But given that you don't, if it really is a creative process, you don't know what that function is until it already occurs. So that's kind of what I, you know, when I hear him talking about tendencies, it's like you can talk about tendencies and trajectories, but that doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen in the future. So it's kind of a vague notion in my mind.
No. Think of when meteorologists plot the path of a tropical storm or a hurricane. The further away the prediction is from where the hurricane is right at that moment, the wider, right, is the area where they're saying the hurricane could end up. So I mean, to me, but they don't say it could literally be 180 degrees. You know, it's still a finite amount of space. So, I mean, I think tendency, Nevid, I mean, your idea of tendency and the importance of that is right on target with what Bergson's getting at.
Yeah, it also made me think, I don't know if he references it specifically, but it made me think about like limits. Like when we talk about curves, usually there's like a limit and there's some kind of like value that it's approaching asymptotically, and yet it never reaches that value. You know, it's constantly approaching, it's getting closer and closer and closer, but it'll never reach that. Yet the way we define it is by a value that it never reaches, you know? So that's kind of like we're defining it by something that it never even gets to, but it's the closest thing we have to describe it, so.
There's also kind of like just the whole notion of a kind of average or a generality in terms of understanding something is also kind of seems to be along the same notion. And that, so I watched that video that Sean sent last time about the complexity and chaos or whatnot, and they give some really good examples. One of them, though, I think is really simple in that he's talking about just chaotic systems where you're always going to have some kind of fuzziness to them because it's built into the system itself. And some of them, because they're these open systems, there's always going to be kind of like chance encounters that play a role and that can't be isolated from the system, because the system itself is only functional because it's an open system that has capacity to be influenced by all these different factors, because it's not some kind of self-isolated thing. So one example, though, that I think is pretty easy to see is that he talks about trials for a vaccine. So he's talking about, like, well, if reductionism isn't completely accurate, does that mean we should just throw it all out? No, it's still very helpful in terms of, these very, like, set phenomena, and in terms of, just basic practical efficiency. So if I'm trying to do a trial for a vaccine, and something, I do it for, you give it to like 300 kids or something, and it helps with, 299, but one of them has some kind of like horrible reaction and dies or something. Basically, you take that 299 and say, like, that on average, this is going to be the mechanism that works, that helps, that is going to function in most cases. But then, well, what about that one kid? Basically, how do you understand that? So you're saying, like, should we go and then look at, like, the parts of that kid, like look at his genes and or whatnot, saying no, basically that's part of, like, this chaotic system, that you're always going to have these remainders that don't always fit the average. And the same thing, I think that's true with basically all of our categories of thinking that we can think of, that there's always going to be some kind of remainder where we see that these static notions that we put on the things, whether we cut things up into these given elements or whatever it is, we give some kind of a trajectory. There's always going to be something outside of that. And I think that's what he's getting at, but he's kind of giving us a notion of how time kind of works, and why it is that there is this variability, because that's part of this notion of time itself, which is also this kind of basic ontological force. So I think that's where it's kind of interesting, and that, he's going along with some of these, new notions of relatively new, like complexity systems theory and all that. I think started like in the 70s or whatnot, and that I think he does apply to that somewhat, and that's interesting. But then he's giving a kind of, somewhat of like a metaphysics of time about why that might be, which I think is interesting, which is also kind of not just like a time or a process philosophy. It's also a kind of holism, and where, like, what is real is the whole of things. So I think that's interesting to, I'll leave there.
When maybe I misread Hunter at the very beginning when we read the passage about on 47 again, if our action be one that involves the whole of our person and is truly ours. It seems like Hunter was being a little cynical, like that's just sort of wishful thinking, that we're free. But if that is what he means by free, between that and the sort of things that Chase is saying, it is an odd kind of freedom, because if, he seems to, be suggesting that whereas action might be novel, it might, and so it's free in the sense that it's an authentic creation of the whole person, but if it's not, but it may not be something that I can consciously reflect on and know, oh, I chose that action. So, maybe free in the sense of it is a resultant, not even the resultant, but it is the outcome of this process of my entire being. But if that's the case, there's lots of my entire being that I don't have conscious access to. And then if, Chase is suggesting there's this kind of holism, so that in some sense, my decision, or let's say my action, is a manifestation of the entire universe. And so, because I am sort of intricately involved with the whole thing. And so even though my action may be creative in the sense of being not predetermined, it isn't necessarily something that I would call free in the sense of, you know, like contemporary ethical theory, where free being is, I know what I want to do and I can choose to do this rather than that. Go ahead, Hunter.
Well, I really like the way you're thinking, because you kind of brought me back around. You, through talking, I was initially like, yeah, pish posh, Bergson, nice freedom, you know. But I think, and that's just because maybe it's because I love to disagree, but you putting it out so plainly, I think I have an example that I think refers to the kind of freedom that Bergson's talking about. So I think and this is all Zizek. This is not me at all. I am not this smart, but this is just stuff I heard a guy say. But I think that love, the idea of love, is a very good example of the action as novel that cannot be reflected and decided on as being free. I think love, and here, let me, and you probably already know where I'm going with this, but you can't be told by another person, yeah, you can't be told by another person who to love. You know, if your dad or your mom says, you got to marry this guy or this woman, you say, oh, God, okay, I guess I will, but I'm not going to just love them. I can't just start loving them because some dictator came and told me to. But then, at the same time, I never sit and I say, today I am going to fall in love. Or perhaps this girl whom I'm seeing, or this person that I'm romantic with, I think I'm going to fall in love with them. Yeah, I think that sounds good. That might, you know, be good for my financial situation if I fell in love with her. You never fall in love. You only realize that you are already in love. And just in the same way, you realize that you have done something totally free, that nobody else in the whole world could have forced you to do, but that you had no decision in. You had no control over whether or not you were going to love somebody, but it only came from you, this totally imposed freedom, in a way. You know what I'm saying? But I think that's at the core. It's this radical conception of freedom that is this totally imposed thing that I think is brought further and made more explicit in thinkers like Zizek. But somebody tell me if I'm veering off the rails, because I think that's what he's kind of getting at, but I don't know.
I am in agreement with you, Hunter. I think that resonates with my reading. And I feel like there was a point in maybe the last seminars section where he says something about like we consciously don't have access to like all the things that are going into our like decision making, the actions that we conduct, but that there's like he alludes to some like, you know, more general aspect of ourselves that is taking everything into account and that is like acting out of that, but it is like that's like where the free action is occurring, and that's not determined, but it's like that's not completely like conscious and accessible to us. I'm looking for it, but I can't find it. I'll pipe in if I find it.
Hunter, I mean, you know, not being an expert, but that sounds like a great example to me. I mean, it fits with, you know, that passage, and you know, I mean, the weird thing is, you know, if your interpretation is correct, you can look back and say, oh, that was a free action, but in the middle of doing it, you know, it wasn't like I choose to do a free action. It's like, oh, that was a free action, but I don't know. It fits with my vague understanding of Bergson here.
Does that mean that we can look back on things and just kind of retroactively decide like, oh, that was free, that was forced, that was a little less free, that was totally free, you know?
I think when we're in the middle of acting, that's not going through our minds. We're not looking at causality, right? I mean, if we're constantly looking at causality as we were acting, I don't think we would move.
You know, I'm remembering something. Let's see. I can't remember if Joey or let's see, maybe Madeline. I was in that Time and Free Will seminar, but which is a book by Bergson. But I vaguely remember him talking about there being this core. I don't even know what he called it. I don't know if he called it a self or a mind or what, but this core from which free action can emanate, and I'm willing to think at this point it's free in the sense that Hunter is talking about, but that it kind of gets encrusted over with with this calcified set of, I mean, this starts sounding like Sartre or something, but this calcified set of expectations and roles and all that kind of stuff. And so that it is possible to act in an unfree way. I mean, this is, again, me remembering Bergson, so it could be wrong, but there is a sort of unfree action which can be, in fact, in a sense, determined not from this core self, if that's what he calls it, that's emerging through the process of duration, but that can emerge from this sort of calcified set of expectations and roles and all those kinds of things that we can develop over the course of our lives and that can be imposed on us by culture and so on. So that's not his goal here to talk about that stuff, but I think he does make a distinction between free and unfree action. But even then, I do remember the notion of free that I got there was an odd, I don't know if I want to say odd, but let's say a subtle notion of freedom that was, in my mind, still fits with sort of Hunter's description of it.
I have a question for you, Reeser, if that's okay.
Uh-huh.
When you're saying these are you saying that this calcified sort of, and this, these calcified sort of social formations, these constellations that affect our being and determine what we do to some degree or impact what we do, would you say that that the reason that that's a sort of determination is because it's seeping into what Joey was saying, this general form of ourselves that's not entirely conscious or open to it, this part of ourself that decides to fall in love is getting kind of polluted behind our eyeballs, like behind our vision, behind our awareness, away from our conscious understanding, that we are just getting kind of like a suggestion, almost like a
something like that.
Super ego.
The metaphor that came to my mind, and I don't know if it's just my metaphor, if it's Bergson's, but was that core gets kind of, the picture I had is like if you have a molten core of lava or something, and then on the outside kind of cools and you have this outer crust. That was kind of the feeling I had, that there's this sort of outer crust that we can that we can act on, our action can be motivated from this, deeper molten core of some sort, but I don't even remember how you do one or the other, but something like what you're saying. There's a way in which our actions can be driven more by these real external determinants more than by who we are. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Joey. Joey? Is Joey frozen? I think Joey froze.
Hello.
Joey, are you back? Nope. I cut Joey off, so I was feeling bad about cutting him off.
So I've been going back to phenomenology of perception, looking for that, because I think that's kind of, we're talking about freedom, is it in these conscious choices or whatever. So Merleau-Ponty says the exact opposite. He's saying, basically that it's not. It's in kind of our total sort of being in the world, our total interaction in this, and in sense giving and our perception that's there, it just in our basic interaction of being, that's really where freedom is as a kind of existential mode of existence, rather than as, just some choice or an act of one kind versus another. So I think Bergson, he wants to say something kind of along those lines more so than any kind of, a conscious decision or whatnot. So I wasn't able to pay attention in the last, few minutes because I was looking for this stuff so much. So I may have just like inserted a total non sequitur. I don't know. But yeah, maybe somebody can brief me on like the past like 2 minutes that I missed.
Well, I was just relating back to Ponty. I thought that I just kind of remember thinking when I was thinking about the mechanism and finality kind of duality. You know, I was thinking a lot about Ponty and kind of the dualities we were talking about near the end of that book, and how the visible and the invisible, and how, you know, like there are different elements of like the flesh of these kind of things. And I feel like maybe in the same way freedom can be that, you know, like there's freedom in nature and in life, but there's also a freedom in perception that can be different. And, you know, yeah, so I was kind of thinking of it as it did kind of coincide, considering, you know, this kind of discussion is like an element of living and experience that's kind of having to be reconciled.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of what Merleau-Ponty talks about with kind of dimensions of existence, where he talks about elements as these things that are distinct, yet are also kind of dispersed in this ambiguous way. So he talks about, you know, sexuality this way. He talks about space this way. He talks about a lot of even, what was the other one? One was kind of like a class consciousness kind of thing. He talked about also in the same way that it's a kind of dimension of our, or like a social, you know, social existence would be another one that's kind of dispersed through all these things. And he talks about psychology in the same way that, you know, say maybe Freud would say that, you know, this thing happens because of this, you know, aspect of sexual psychology, and it's clear as that. It's simple mechanism that's correlated in this exact, you know, point for point way. And Merleau-Ponty and I think Bergson too would want to say, no, these things are kind of dispersed in this kind of holistic way. You can't exactly isolate these things from one another, because the more of a, I think Bergson would say more like that they're kind of like an integrated system in a way, where Merleau-Ponty might want to just say, you know, like, no, it's kind of like more like a field of some kind of dimensionality of existence where these things are just kind of dispersed throughout. So I think that's one way to think of these things, that they're talking about, you know, Merleau-Ponty talks about, we should see things not as like determinants of whatever, but as kind of like motivations. That, you know, you see something in your perceptual field that gives you a motivation of some kind, but it doesn't give you exactly some kind of, you know, mechanized reaction. And I think Bergson definitely wants to say the same thing, and he even almost defines life as this way of kind of interrupting this kind of reactionary aspect of, you know, input output. He's basically saying that consciousness in a certain way is this way of kind of putting some kind of a wedge between the input that we get from the world and this kind of output. And I think that's an interesting notion. You could maybe say that does that mean that he's saying that, you know, that our actions are these kind of, you know, conscious decisions? I think he would say that that's kind of like a particular speciality, a special expression of our freedom, and not necessarily that that's the only thing that's free and these other things are not free. I think it's kind of like on a sort of gradient, sort of continuum in a way, although that may be too spatial of terminology, but I think that's kind of where he's coming from, and where he kind of also coincides with Merleau-Ponty on.
So it's a little after 4. Joey and Ed seem to be trying to say something, and I kind of ran over them. Does you guys want to make any closing remarks?
Thank you very much.
Mark.
Joe, were you going to say something?
No remarks. Bad
Oh,
internet.
okay.
I feel you on that.
I was just thinking again, Chase, you talked about occurrences spatially, and you seem to be a little uncomfortable with it. But again, it seems to me we have to talk about spatiality and we have to talk about the temporal aspect at the same time. That those two can't be divorced. And I think that that's what complicates what we're trying to understand, or what Bergson is trying to understand, and what we're trying to understand of his understanding. It's always that spatial, temporal mess merging together. That's really the gut of it.
Hmm. I think it's because I say that just because Bergson is trying to kind of get us away from thinking always in terms of spatial categories. Although at the same time, he says that's basically how our intellect functions. And if you talk at all, I think you basically realize that he's right about that, that we do have to talk in these kind of spatial categories. But I think you're right, Ed, in the sense that, yeah, he's trying to kind of mix these up, you know? He's kind of trying to show how you can't easily separate these, and that time is always embedded in the way that space actually is, that they are kind of space-time. But then he's also, I think mainly what he wants to do is the way that we conceptualize time spatially. He's mainly trying to warn us about that aspect of space more than anything, which I can understand. But he's not exactly saying, like space is not real. He's saying that it's just embedded with time in this very kind of mixed up way. So that's just why I say that.
This may again been from Time and Free Will, but I remember Bergson saying that motion in space is primarily continuous, and that it is secondarily discrete upon analysis. And so, he seemed to think that something like Zeno's paradox and things of that sort are based on a misunderstanding of this. And so, he uses analogies like when you shoot an arrow and you see an arrow flying, what's whole is the flight of the arrow. And the flight of an arrow is not an arrow flying through a bunch of discrete points, because those you could analyze. Part of Zeno's observation is you could subdivide that arc and forever and never come to the end of it, but that what's really whole is the motion. And so it's a similar, I think it's a similar, I don't know exactly what that says about the relation between time and space, but that there's a continuity and a holism, for everything for him. It's not just like a holism in time, but I think, the holism in space, and then those two are probably deeply integrated somehow, I would imagine. Okay, are we done for the day?
I think so.
Okay, and I recorded it, so I'm proud of myself. And we'll see you Wednesday or Friday.
All right. See y'all later.
I can do that too. Bye-bye.
Bye.